March 28, 1943. North Africa. The desert sun was setting over the Allied headquarters when General Omar Bradley walked into his office and made the hardest decision of his entire military career. He was about to fire Major General Terry Allen, the commander of the legendary 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Allen was a war hero, a fighter, a leader who'd taken his men through hell and back, from the beaches of North Africa to the mountains of Sicily. His soldiers worshipped him, his enemies feared him, but Bradley didn't care, because Terry Allen had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, too wild to control. What happened next would spark one of the most controversial moments in World War II, a firing that would haunt both men for the rest of their lives, and raise a question that still echoes through military history today. When does a commander become too good at killing the enemy? When does being the most feared night fighter in the American Army become a liability instead of an asset? This is the true story of Terry Allen's revenge. Before we dive into this explosive story, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because here at Wasim Rind we bring you the most incredible, most jaw-dropping military stories that actually happened. Stories about real warriors, real battles, real courage, and real controversy. You won't find this stuff in your high school history books. So subscribe, turn on those notifications, and let's get into one of the most intense command disputes of the entire Second World War. Let me take you back to 1942. The United States had been in World War II for less than a year. American troops were green, untested, and frankly, they were getting their butts kicked. The Germans had been fighting for 3 years. They were experienced, battle-hardened, ruthless. They had the best tanks, the best tactics, and commanders who'd conquered most of Europe. The Americans needed someone who could match that intensity, that aggression, that killer instinct. They needed a warrior who wouldn't back down, wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't lose. They needed Terry Allen. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen was 49 years old in 1942, which was ancient by combat commander standards. Most division commanders were in their 30s or early 40s, but Allen wasn't like most commanders. He was a throwback to an earlier era, a cavalry officer who'd fought in the Mexican expedition under Pershing, who'd earned a Silver Star in World War I, who'd spent 20 years in the peacetime army just waiting for another chance to fight. He was rough, crude, he drank too much, he cursed like a sailor, he didn't give a damn about regulations or protocol or proper military decorum. What he cared about was killing Germans. And when the army needed someone to take the 1st Infantry Division into combat for the first time since World War I, they chose Terry Allen because they knew he'd get the job done. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was the oldest and most storied division in the American Army. They'd fought in France in 1918. They'd bled at Cantigny, at Soissons, at the Meuse-Argonne. They had a reputation to uphold. And when Allen took command in June of 1942, he made it clear what his expectations were. Fight hard, fight dirty, win. Everything else was secondary. He didn't care if his men saluted properly, didn't care if they wore their uniforms correctly, didn't care if they got drunk on leave and tore up every bar from Casablanca to Cairo. As long as they killed Germans when it mattered, Allen would back them up against anyone. His second in command was Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Teddy Roosevelt's oldest son, a politician turned soldier who was even older than Allen at 55, but just as aggressive, just as fearless. Together, Allen and Roosevelt created a division culture that was unlike anything else in the American Army. They trained their men brutally, forced marches in the desert heat, live-fire exercises at night, close-quarters combat drills. They wanted their soldiers to be comfortable in chaos, confident in darkness, ruthless in close combat. They wanted night fighters, killers who could operate when visibility was zero and confusion was maximum. And that's exactly what they got. Allen's training philosophy was simple but revolutionary for the American Army at that time. Most divisions trained during daylight hours, practiced parade ground maneuvers, focused on textbook tactics straight from the manual. Allen threw the manual out the window. He had his men training at 2 in the morning, stumbling through the desert in complete darkness, learning to navigate by stars and instinct, learning to communicate without radios, learning to kill silently with knives and bare hands. He brought in British commandos to teach close quarters combat. He had his officers study German tactics, learning how the enemy thought, how they fought, what their weaknesses were, and most controversially, he encouraged his men to think for themselves, to ignore orders orders if those orders didn't make sense in the moment, to trust their instincts over the chain of command. This approach horrified the old-school officers who believed that an army ran on strict discipline and unquestioning obedience. But Allen didn't care about their opinions. He'd been in combat. He knew that battles were chaos, that plans fell apart the moment the first shot was fired, that the side that could adapt fastest usually won. He wanted soldiers who could think, who could improvise, who could take initiative when their officers were dead and the radio was out and everything was going to hell. He was building commandos, not parade ground soldiers, and the Big Red One was transforming into exactly that. November 8th, 1942. Operation Torch. The Allied invasion of North Africa. The Big Red One was going in on the first wave, hitting the beaches at Oran in Algeria. It was supposed to be relatively easy. The Vichy French forces defending the area weren't supposed to put up much resistance. They were supposed to fold quickly and let the Americans land unopposed. Intelligence had assured everyone that the French wouldn't fight, that this would be more of a show of force than an actual combat operation. But somebody forgot to tell the French defenders. When Allen's men hit the beach at 0100 hours on a moonless night, they ran straight into heavy machine gun fire, artillery bombardment, and determined resistance. Men were getting cut down in the surf. Landing craft were burning. The whole operation was on the verge of turning into a bloodbath, but Terry Allen didn't panic. While other commanders were calling for reinforcements, calling for naval gunfire support, calling for someone to tell them what to do, Allen was already moving. He moved his command post right up to the beach, stood there under fire with shells landing all around him, shrapnel whizzing past his head, and started directing his units with the calm precision of a man who'd done this 100 times before. He didn't yell, didn't rush, just calmly pointed to positions on his map, gave clear, concise orders, and sent his battalions exactly where they needed to go. He sent flanking units around the strong points, called in naval gunfire on the French positions that were causing the most trouble. And then, when one particularly stubborn bunker was holding up the entire advance, he personally led a company of infantry in an assault that cleared it out with grenades and bayonets. By the end of the first day, the beach was secure. By the end of the second day, Oran had surrendered. The French commanders were actually impressed by how the Americans had fought, commented that these weren't the green troops they'd been expecting. Allen had proven that his division could fight, but more importantly, he'd proven they could win. The Big Red One had baptized itself in fire and come out harder than steel. Over the next 6 months, the Big Red One fought across North Africa. They learned the hard way what combat against the Wehrmacht really meant. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the Americans suffered their first major defeat of the war. German panzers under Rommel's command tore through American positions like tissue paper. Entire units broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. It was a humiliation that shook American confidence to its core. But Allen's division was one of the few units that held its ground, that counterattacked, that turned what could have been a total rout into a fighting retreat. They took heavy casualties doing it, lost good men, but they didn't break, they didn't run, and they learned. After Kasserine, the Big Red One was different, harder, meaner, more aggressive. They'd seen what the Germans could do and they weren't impressed anymore. They weren't scared, they were angry. Allen channeled that anger into tactical innovation. He started specializing in night attacks, hitting German positions in the darkness when the enemy couldn't see them coming, couldn't coordinate their superior firepower, couldn't use their tactical advantages. The first few night attacks were disasters. Units got lost in the darkness. Friendly fire incidents killed more Americans than Germans. But Allen kept pushing, kept refining the tactics, kept training his men until they could move through the night like predators. By the time they reached Tunisia in the spring of 1943, the Big Red One had become something unique in the American army. They were night fighters, specialists in darkness and chaos. They'd attack at 0200 hours when the Germans were asleep, when sentries were tired, when reaction times were slow. They'd infiltrate through German lines, get in close with grenades and knives and shotguns, create confusion and terror. German units started reporting ghost attacks. Americans who appeared out of nowhere in the darkness, killed everyone in a position, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. It was psychological warfare as much as physical combat. The Germans started to dread sunset when they were facing the Big Red One. The problem was that Allen ran his division like a private army. He ignored orders he didn't like. He argued with his superiors constantly. When he received an operation order that he thought was stupid, he'd nod politely, say yes sir, and then go do whatever he thought would work better. He let his men get away with behavior that would have gotten soldiers in other divisions court-martialed. There were reports of looting, drunkenness, massive brawls with military police, incidents where Big Red One soldiers shot up towns on leave, got into firefights with soldiers from other divisions, decisions, refused to follow orders from officers outside their chain of command. One particularly notorious incident involved a bar in Algiers where Big Red One soldiers got into a fight with British paratroopers that turned into a full-scale riot, requiring the intervention of MPs from 3 different nations. Allen didn't just tolerate this behavior, he actively encouraged it. He wanted his men to be aggressive, to be violent, to have that edge that made them deadly in combat. He believed that you couldn't turn that aggression on and off like a light switch, that if you wanted soldiers who would charge a German machine gun position without hesitation, you had to accept that those same soldiers would be hell to deal with when they weren't in combat. He'd show up at the stockade where his men were being held for various infractions, bail them out personally, tell the MPs that these were his soldiers and he'd handle their discipline, which usually meant a stern lecture followed by absolutely no punishment whatsoever. His immediate superior was Major General Omar Bradley, the commander of Second Corps. Bradley was everything Allen wasn't: calm, methodical, by the book. A schoolteacher turned soldier who believed in planning, in preparation, in doing things the right way. Bradley believed in discipline, in order, in running a tight ship. He believed that good soldiers followed orders without question, maintained proper military bearing at all times, and could be counted on to execute complex operations exactly as planned. He looked at warfare as a science, something that could be studied and mastered through careful analysis and rigid application of proven principles. Allen believed that good soldiers killed the enemy by any means necessary, and everything else was just paperwork. He looked at warfare as an art, something that required instinct and improvisation and the willingness to take risks that no textbook would ever approve. The two men clashed constantly from the moment Bradley took command of 2 Corps. Bradley would issue a detailed operation order with precise timelines and coordination requirements. Allen would read it, understand it, then do whatever he thought was tactically sound in the moment. Bradley would call him in, chew him out, threaten him with relief of command. Allen would apologize, promise to do better, then go right back to doing things his way the next time. But here's the thing that made the situation so frustrating for Bradley. Allen kept winning. That was the fundamental problem. No matter how much Allen bent the rules, no matter how much chaos his division caused, no matter how many complaints Bradley received from other commanders, the Big Red One kept delivering victories. At Gafsa, at El Guetar, at Hill 609, Allen's division was always at the tip of the spear, always in the hardest fighting, always coming out on top. His tactics were unconventional, sometimes borderline reckless, but they worked. Enemy positions that were supposed to take days to reduce would fall in hours when Allen's night fighters hit them. German commanders who were accustomed to American cautiousness and predictability found themselves dealing with an enemy that attacked when and where they least expected it. One particular engagement became legendary within the division. A German strongpoint on Hill 523 was holding up the entire Allied advance. It was well fortified, well defended, had clear fields of fire in every direction. A conventional assault would cost hundreds of casualties. Bradley's plan called for a week of artillery preparation, followed by a coordinated daylight assault with air support. Allen looked at the plan, looked at the hill, and decided there was a better way. That night, with no artillery preparation, no air support, no coordination with adjacent units, he sent 2 companies of infantry up the backside of the hill in complete darkness. They climbed for 3 hours, carrying their weapons and ammunition, moving in absolute silence. At 0300 hours, they were in position directly behind the German bunkers. At 0301, they attacked. The fight lasted 15 minutes. By 0320, the hill was in American hands, and the Germans were either dead or running. Total American casualties: 8 wounded, none killed. Bradley was furious. The operation had worked, but it had been conducted in complete violation of his orders. There had been no coordination, no backup plan if things went wrong, no way to support Allen's men if they'd gotten into trouble. From Bradley's perspective, Allen had gotten lucky. From Allen's perspective, he'd assessed the situation correctly and executed a brilliant tactical maneuver that saved American lives. Both men were right from their own perspective, and that was the core of the problem. The situation came to a head during the planning for the invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky was going to be the biggest amphibious operation of the war so far, larger even than the North Africa landings. The Allies were going to invade Hitler's fortress Europe for the first time, hitting the island of Sicily as a stepping stone toward Italy. The planning was incredibly complex, involving multiple nations, multiple services, precise coordination of naval, air, and ground forces. Bradley needed commanders he could count on to execute the plan exactly as written, and he was increasingly convinced that Terry Allen was not that commander. Still, Allen's combat record was undeniable. The Big Red One was selected for the assault, landing on the southern coast near Gela, alongside the 3rd Infantry Division. It was going to be the toughest fight they'd faced yet. The island was defended by Italian coastal divisions and German panzer units, including elements of the elite Hermann Gring division. The terrain was brutal, all mountains and narrow roads perfect for defense. Intelligence estimated very heavy casualties in the initial landing. Allen didn't care about the estimates. He told his men they were going in first because they were the best, because they'd earned it through blood and fire in North Africa, because nobody else could do what they did. And his men believed him. The landing on July 10, 1943 was chaos from the beginning. The weather was worse than predicted, with rough seas that scattered the landing craft and made soldiers seasick before they even reached the beach. The airborne drops that were supposed to secure key positions inland had been blown off course, with paratroopers scattered across dozens of miles. The naval bombardment had been less effective than hoped, and when the first waves hit the beach at 0245 hours, they discovered that the Italian defenders were much more determined than intelligence had predicted. Machine gun fire raked the beaches. Artillery shells landed among the landing craft. Men were drowning in the surf, weighed down by their equipment. It looked like a disaster in the making. But Allen's training paid off. His men had practiced amphibious landings for months. They knew what to do even in chaos. Small unit leaders took charge when their officers went down. Squads and platoons fought their way off the beach independently, not waiting for orders, not waiting for the overall plan to come together. They just moved inland, attacking anything that shot at them, securing positions, linking up with other units when they could. By dawn, despite the chaos, despite the casualties, the Big Red One had established a solid beachhead. They'd done exactly what Allen had trained them to do: adapt, improvise, overcome. And then the Germans counterattacked. The Hermann Gring Panzer Division came rolling down from the north with orders to throw the Americans back into the sea. These weren't the semi-trained Italian coastal troops. These were elite German soldiers with Tiger tanks, Panzer IVs, mobile artillery, everything they needed to crush the exposed American beachhead. The fighting around Gela became absolutely desperate. American infantry with bazookas and sticky bombs going toe-to-toe with 60-ton tanks. Naval destroyers running themselves practically onto the beach to provide fire support, firing their 5-inch guns at German armor from point-blank range. Artillery batteries firing over open sights at approaching panzers. And right in the middle of it all was Terry Allen. Allen set up his command post in a shot-up building maybe 500 yards from the front line. Shells were landing all around. The building shook with each impact. His staff officers were begging him to move back, to find somewhere safer. Allen refused. He needed to be close enough to see what was happening, to make decisions in real time, to personally direct the battle. He stood at a window with binoculars, watching German tanks advance, calling in naval gunfire coordinates, redirecting infantry units to plug gaps in the line. At one point, a Tiger tank got within 300 yards of his position before a destroyer offshore finally landed a direct hit on it. The explosion blew out what few windows were left in Allen's command post. He just brushed the glass off his map and kept working. The battle raged all day, wave after wave of German armor trying to break through, American infantry holding by their fingernails. By late afternoon, the Germans had committed everything they had. Their final assault came at 1700 hours, a concentrated attack with over 50 tanks trying to punch through the American lines at their weakest point. Allen saw it developing, realized that his infantry couldn't stop it alone, and made a desperate call to the Navy. Within minutes, every destroyer and cruiser offshore was firing at maximum rate. The naval shells came screaming in like freight trains, landing among the German tanks, turning the battlefield into an inferno. The German attack faltered, broke, retreated. By 1800 hours, it was over. The beachhead had held. Terry Allen had won again, against superior armored forces, in the most desperate circumstances, with everything on the line. His division had held the line and defeated a German counterattack that by all rights should have succeeded. His reputation grew even larger. To his men, he was the general who stood firm when everyone else was ready to run, the commander who'd stop German panzers with nothing but guts and determination. They'd follow him anywhere, do anything he asked. To them, Terry Allen was invincible, a warrior general straight out of ancient history. But to Omar Bradley, Terry Allen had become a problem that could no longer be ignored. The incidents were piling up faster than they could be covered up. During the advance inland from Gela, Big Red One soldiers had gotten into a massive firefight with Canadian troops over who had liberated a particular town first. In another incident, Allen's men had commandeered British trucks at gunpoint when their own vehicles broke down. There were reports of systematic looting, of Sicilian civilians being roughed up, of Allen personally intervening to prevent his men from being disciplined for infractions that would have gotten anyone else thrown in the stockade or worse. Bradley had received formal complaints from British commanders, from Canadian commanders, from other American divisions. His own staff was telling him that something had to be done about the Big Red One before their indiscipline infected other units. The final straw came in early August during the advance on Troina, a hilltop town that the Germans had turned into a fortress. Bradley's operations order called for a coordinated attack involving the Big Red One and the 3rd Infantry Division. The plan was detailed and precise. Both divisions would attack simultaneously from different directions at 0600 hours on August 6th. The timing was critical. If one division attacked without the other, the Germans could shift all their forces to stop it. If both attacked together, they'd divide the German defenses and achieve breakthrough. It was basic military coordination, the kind of thing that should have been routine. Allen read the order, understood it perfectly, and then, at 2300 hours on August 5th, 7 hours before the scheduled attack, he sent his infantry forward. He'd seen an opportunity. German positions that were normally heavily defended looked thinly held. If he hit them now, in the darkness, he could probably break through before the Germans could react. It was the kind of tactical judgment that had served him so well in North Africa and earlier in Sicily. His night fighters swept forward, caught the Germans off guard, and punched through their lines. By dawn, they'd achieved most of their objectives. The 3rd Division, following the original plan, attacked at 0600 into positions that were already being abandoned as the Germans pulled back to avoid encirclement. From a tactical standpoint, it was brilliant. From a command and control standpoint, it was the last straw. Bradley called Allen to the 2nd Corps headquarters on August 7th. The meeting was short and brutal. Bradley told Allen he was being relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division, effective immediately. Allen was stunned. He'd just won another victory. His division had performed brilliantly throughout the entire Sicily campaign. They'd taken their objectives with fewer casualties than any other division involved in the invasion. They had the highest kill ratio against German forces. By every objective measure of combat effectiveness, they were the best division in the theater. And now he was being fired? Bradley explained that it wasn't about tactical success. It was never about tactical success. It was about discipline. It was about following orders. It was about being able to trust your subordinate commanders to do what they're told, when they're told, how they're told to do it. Allen had proven repeatedly that he couldn't or wouldn't do that. He operated according to his own judgment, his own timeline, his own priorities. In a small unit, that might be acceptable. In a division, part of a corps, part of an army conducting operations across an entire theater, it was impossible. Bradley needed commanders who would execute the plan, not freelance. Allen had to go. Now pause right here, and let me ask you something critical. Drop a comment and tell me what you think about this situation. Was Bradley right to fire Allen? Do you prioritize discipline and order even if it means getting rid of your best combat commander? Or do you tolerate a maverick if he keeps delivering victories and saving American lives? Because this question doesn't have an easy answer, and military historians still debate it today. I want to know where you stand on this. Allen left Sicily on August 10th, 1943. He was replaced by Major General Clarence Hubner, a strict disciplinarian who'd spent most of his career in staff positions. Hubner immediately cracked down on the Big Red One's wild behavior. He instituted mandatory inspections, enforced uniform regulations that Allen had ignored, started court-martialing soldiers who stepped out of line. No exceptions, no special treatment. He banned alcohol, restricted leave, turned the division from Allen's private army of night fighters back into a conventional military unit. The division's culture changed almost overnight. The men hated it. They felt betrayed. Their general, the man who'd led them through 3 campaigns, who'd stood with them under the worst fire the Germans could throw at them, who'd protected them from the rear echelon bureaucrats, who didn't understand what combat was really like, had been taken away, and he'd been replaced with someone who seemed to care more about polished boots and proper salutes than killing Germans. Morale in the 1st Infantry Division plummeted. There were reports of near mutinous grumbling in the ranks. Some soldiers openly talked about refusing to fight under the new commander, about putting in for transfers, about anything to get away from Hubner's chicken shit regulations. regulations. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who'd been relieved at the same time as Allen for the same reasons, was gone too. The two leaders who'd forged the Big Red One into the most feared division in the American Army had been cashiered, sent home in disgrace, their careers apparently over. It seemed like a tragic end to a brilliant combat record. Allen was 50 years old. He'd been relieved for insubordination. His reputation as a troublemaker preceded him everywhere. No one in the War Department wanted to touch him. He spent weeks in limbo, waiting for orders that everyone assumed would never come. His friends in the Army told him he was done, that he should accept a stateside training command and see out the war teaching new recruits. Allen refused. He wasn't done fighting. He wasn't done proving himself. He just needed one more chance. That chance came in December 1943. The Army was activating the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, for deployment to Europe. They needed a commander with combat experience. Someone who could take a green division full of draftees and turn them into combat-effective soldiers in less than a year. Despite all his problems, despite all the headaches he'd caused Bradley and the rest of the high command, Terry Allen was still recognized as one of the best trainers and combat leaders the Army had. Someone in the War Department, probably George Marshall himself, decided to give him another shot. But there were conditions. Allen would have to prove he could operate within the system. No more cowboy operations. No more ignoring orders. No more treating his division like a personal fiefdom. One more incident, and he was done for good. Allen took command of the 104th in January 1944 at Camp Adair in Oregon, and this time he did things differently. He'd learned from his mistakes, though he'd never publicly admit he'd made any. He understood now that you couldn't win the war by yourself, that you had to work within the larger command structure even if you didn't always agree with it. He trained the Timberwolves using all the hard-earned lessons from North Africa and Sicily, the brutal forced marches, the night combat training, the emphasis on small unit initiative and aggressive tactics. He turned them into night fighters, just like he'd done with the Big Red One. But this time, he also maintained strict discipline when they weren't training. He enforced regulations. He coordinated with higher headquarters. He became the commander Bradley had wanted him to be all along, but without losing the tactical edge that made him deadly in combat. The transformation was remarkable. The 104th Division went from raw recruits to combat ready in 9 months, one of the fastest training cycles of the entire war. When they shipped out to Europe in September 1944, 3 months after D-Day, they were as prepared as any division could be. They landed in France, moved up to the front in Holland, and went into the line in October, and they fought brilliantly from day one. Allen had created another division of night fighters, specialists in darkness and close combat, but this time they were also disciplined, reliable, able to execute complex operations as part of the larger Allied advance into Germany. The 104th fought through some of the worst combat of the war. They pushed through the Siegfried Line in November, a supposedly impenetrable fortification system that had been designed to stop exactly this kind of assault. They fought in the Hurtgen Forest, one of the most horrific battles in American military history, where divisions were chewed up and destroyed in a matter of weeks. The 104th took heavy casualties, but they never broke, never retreated, never failed to accomplish their mission. In March 1945, they were one of the first American units to capture a major German city when they took Cologne after a week of brutal street fighting. And in April, they pushed all the way to the Elbe River, where they met Soviet forces advancing from the east. The war in Europe was effectively over. Terry Allen had proven his point in the most definitive way possible. He'd taken a green division with zero combat experience and turned them into hardened veterans in less than a year of actual fighting. The 104th had one of the best combat records of any American division in the European theater. They'd fought for 195 consecutive days without relief. They'd liberated dozens of towns and cities. They'd captured over 30,000 German prisoners. They'd done everything that had been asked of them, and more. And they'd done it under the leadership of the same man who'd been fired from the Big Red One for being too aggressive and too undisciplined. Allen had gotten his revenge, not through bitterness or recrimination or public complaints about how he'd been treated. He'd gotten his revenge by succeeding spectacularly with a new command, by proving that the problem in Sicily wasn't his tactical judgment or his leadership ability. The problem had been his relationship with Bradley, his unwillingness to subordinate his own judgment to the larger plan. And he'd fixed that. He'd shown that he could be both aggressive and disciplined, both a fighter and a team player. It was the ultimate vindication. When the the war ended in May 1945, both divisions that Terry Allen had commanded were recognized as elite units. The 1st Infantry Division would go on to serve with distinction in every American conflict through the present day. The 104th Infantry Division was deactivated after the war, but its combat record in 1944-45 remained one of the best in Army history. And Terry Allen, the general who'd been fired in disgrace, was recognized as one of the finest division commanders America had produced in the entire war. But here's what makes this story so complex and so endlessly fascinating. Bradley wasn't wrong to fire Allen in Sicily. Looking at it objectively, from the perspective of a corps commander trying to coordinate multiple divisions in a complex campaign, Allen had been insubordinate. He had ignored direct orders. He had created disciplinary problems that rippled through the entire two corps. In a military organization, especially in the middle of a war where coordination between units could mean the difference between victory and defeat, you cannot have commanders doing whatever they want, regardless of how successful they are individually. The chaos that would create, the impossibility of conducting large-scale operations, would be catastrophic. Bradley made the hard but necessary decision to prioritize command and control over individual tactical brilliance. But Allen wasn't wrong either. His methods worked. His aggressive night-fighting tactics killed more Germans per casualty suffered than conventional daylight operations. His emphasis on small unit initiative meant his divisions could continue fighting effectively, even when communications broke down and officers were killed. His willingness to take calculated risks created opportunities that more cautious commanders would have missed. In the brutal arithmetic of combat, results matter more than anything else. And Allen delivered results. Both men were right from their own perspectives. Both men were doing what they thought was best for the war effort. That's what makes this one of the great command controversies of World War II. After the war, both Bradley and Allen went on to distinguished careers, though they took very different paths. Bradley became a 5-star general of the Army, the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the architects of NATO and American Cold War strategy. He was called the Soldiers' General and the GI's General, respected for his methodical competence and his genuine care for his troops. He wrote his memoirs, became an elder statesman of the military, and lived to see his reputation as one of America's greatest generals firmly established. Allen retired as a major general in 1946, his career cut short by the relief in Sicily despite his success with the 104th. He never received his 3rd star. He wrote his own memoirs, consulted on military matters, and spent his retirement years in El Paso, Texas. He remained bitter about the relief, though he tried not to show it publicly. In his private papers, in letters to old comrades from the Big Red One and the 104th, you can see the hurt, the sense that he'd been treated unfairly by men who'd never understood what it took to win on the battlefield. He and Bradley never reconciled, never really spoke about what had happened in Sicily. The wound was too deep, the philosophical disagreement too fundamental. If you've made it this far in this story, I need you to do something for me right now. First, absolutely smash that like button, because this is the kind of deep historical content that takes real research and real effort to put together. Second, share this video with anyone who loves military history, who appreciates stories about complicated men making difficult decisions under impossible pressure. Third, subscribe to Wasim Rind if you haven't already, because we bring you these kind of nuanced, detailed historical deep dives every single week. And finally, most importantly, drop a comment. Tell me what you think about this whole situation. Was Bradley right to prioritize discipline over tactical effectiveness? Was Allen right to trust his own judgment over the orders he received? Is there room in a modern military for commanders who color outside the lines when they think the situation demands it? These questions don't have easy answers. Military academies still use the Allen-Bradley conflict as a case study in leadership and command relationships. There's no consensus among military professionals about who was right. I want to hear your perspective. What would you have done if you were in Bradley's position? What would you have done if you were Allen? Let me know in the comments. The legacy of Terry Allen lives on in both divisions he commanded. The 1st Infantry Division still trains its soldiers in night operations, still emphasizes aggressive small unit tactics, still maintains the warrior culture that Allen created in 1942. The 104th Infantry Division was reactivated in 1947 as a training division and continues to serve today. Both divisions consider Terry Allen one of their founding fathers, one of the commanders who made them what they are. And in the broader history of the American military, Allen represents something important. He represents the tension between discipline and initiative, between following orders and trusting your own judgment, between being a good soldier and being a great warrior. That tension exists in every military, in every war, in every generation. And the story of how Terry Allen navigated that tension, how he was destroyed by it, and then ultimately vindicated, remains relevant today. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most controversial command decisions. I'll see you in the next one.